Hi guys, it's Nicole. Welcome to another video. I am not entirely sure what's happening with the lighting today. I've tried playing around with it. This is the best I can come up with, so hopefully this will do. I wanted to do a video where I sat down and spoke to you about all the books I read from the beginning of the year when I wasn't making videos. So this essentially is a wrap up of the books I read from January to the end of August. I'm just going to dive straight in. There's quite a few books to talk about today, so grab a tea, grab a snack. I do want to start off with the book I started with this year. So the first book I finished this year was When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain by Nghi. This is the second book in the Singing Hills novella series. I really liked this and I knew I was gonna like this, and that's why I saved it to be the first book I read this year, and I'm so glad I did. This essentially follows our cleric called Chi, and we were introduced to them in book one, and they essentially travel around meeting people and documenting stories from different people they come across. In this story, they come across a group of tigers. They essentially have to tell a story to the tigers in order to escape the tigers who are threatening to eat and kill Chi. I loved this because it had one of my all-time favorite story elements, which is a story within a story, and I thought it was really interestingly done here. It is a beautifully told story, just like the first book in this series. Nghi has such a enchanting and charming writing style that just makes such a short story. Like, I think these books are only like 150 pages long, maybe not even. I listened to the audiobooks, so I'm not entirely sure. It just feels like so much more than that, like in the best way possible. The story that is contained in the single novellas is really fleshed out, but also we're slowly, just between book one and book two, we're seeing more fleshing out of the world and Chi's place as a cleric in it. I just think it's really beautiful, and I hope that there are so many more stories in this novella series because they are some of my favorites. The next two books I want to talk about are part of a series again. I read Finlay Donovan is Killing It and Finlay Donovan Knocks Them Dead. I loved these. I listened to the audiobooks of both of them. They were such addicting stories, both of these books, that I finished them within a matter of days. We are following our newly single mother who is going through a really rough divorce. She has two young kids. She's quite young herself, like she's only like 31 years old. Her husband is the biggest dick, or ex-husband I should say, is the biggest dick, and he essentially like cheated on her, and now he's like with this other woman. He's really not wanting to help out financially, and just, it's a whole mess. She is a writer, but she doesn't have a hugely successful career, so money is so tight. One day she is at a cafe or restaurant with her agent. They're discussing details of this book she's writing and planning, and she writes in a genre that's a mix of like crime and romance. They're discussing what happens in this book, like the crime going on, the murdering going on, and their conversation is overheard. Finlay is then mistaken as a hitwoman and then is proceeded to be hired as a hitwoman from this person who overheard. Finlay is the most accident-prone character I have ever read about. Like, everything that was happening in the story, the way the plot was moving forward, it was just like accident after accident, and then Finlay trying to fix the mess, and the mess just getting bigger. It was so chaotic, so fun. I loved how quirky it was. I loved how it had a murder mystery thriller aspect. I loved how I didn't know where it was going to go. I really enjoyed following Finlay as a character. I also really enjoyed the friendship that we got to see develop between Finlay and her nanny to her kids. They basically become partners in crime. Like, that's their friendship. And my thoughts for the sequel, Finlay Donovan Knocks Them Dead, is pretty much the same as the first one. I really enjoyed it. I thought the story still had so much going on and was still addictive, and I'm excited to see what's in store for the last one in the series. I think it's the last one. I could be wrong. Next, I want to quickly talk about this book, is The Lady of the Lake, which is book 5 in the Witcher series. Basically, I did a vlog where I've read the first and last book in book series, and this was the last book I had to read for that video, and the rest of the books I read in that video were actually read like last year. So it feels a little bit out of place to be talking about this book here now in this video, but I did just want to mention it because I did technically read this year. I didn't give it a rating because I didn't think it was fair of me to rate this book, as I had skipped multiple books in the series to read this one. But overall, I am glad I skipped most of this series because I don't think I would have enjoyed it. I had a really difficult time with the narration, and like, yes, I skipped a few books to get to this one. I don't like how the story is told. Essentially, it jumps around from so many characters, not just main characters, basically like people our main characters come across. So like a barkeeper or someone who works in some sort of court, like a guard, and like we're introduced to these characters. It's a fairly detailed introduction that you think this character is going to have some significance to the story, but that person, that barkeeper, that guard, that whoever, they have no significance to the story. We're introduced to these characters and then they somehow come across or meet one of the protagonists of this series, and that's kind of how the story flows and jumps around. It is unique, and maybe some people might enjoy that because it can offer other perspectives on these main characters than just the typical 3 main characters that we have. We're getting more perspective, we're getting more insight. But I personally just found it very exhausting as an reading experience because I was trying to keep track of these characters because I thought they were going to be significant, but they're not. I wasn't a fan of the dialogue in this, and then there was just those typical things I took issue with this book that I find in a lot of fantasy books written by males, particularly ones that were written quite some time ago. The women were very objectified and just treated awfully. I think maybe I might have liked this more if I had played the Witcher games. I've actually never played the Witcher games. I've always meant to and have not gotten around to it, so I can see why people get a lot of enjoyment out of these books, especially if they're a huge fan of the franchise, but it wasn't for me. The next book I want to talk about is another like thriller murder mystery type of book, and that is The Thursday Murder Club. I listened to this on audio. This book took me months to listen to. I think I started it in November or December last year and I didn't finish it until about February, maybe. I can't remember, it's been a while. It took me a while, that's what you need to know. The premise of this book made me so excited for it, but I think the execution was disappointing. We're following a group of elderly people who live in a retirement village. They have this club that they call the Thursday Murder Club, where they meet up every single Thursday and they go over old cold cases together and try to solve murders themselves. One of the members was a police officer before she retired, so she somehow has access to these old cold case files. This is their hobby, this is what they've been doing for a long time, and essentially what happens is a murder happens right where they live, and they seize this opportunity to investigate this murder themselves and try and solve the crime. I found it hard at times to distinguish between characters. I thought that their voices weren't very different. The main character, Elizabeth, I think you could tell when it was her, but the rest of them, all the characters just blurred together for me, so I did find it tricky to follow the story, which I'm not personally used to. Like, I feel like because I read so many fantasy books, I can get a little bit confident in how to distinguish between characters, but like here I like lost all confidence and I was so confused. I think this might have had to do with the narrator of the audiobook, I do want to point out. I think what it really came down to though was the story and the mystery was a little bit too complicated for me. I do like a simplistic sort of one mystery narrative, whereas this story just kept going down all these different routes, which was, I guess, the point, and a lot of people might like, because, you know, it's going to take you down one way and then it's a dead end and they're going to turn around and go down another way, and it keeps that intrigue. For me, it got to the point where there was no intrigue, there was just exhaustion. I just wanted to know, I just wanted to get it over with, and then we found out in the end, and I just didn't feel the payoff. So yeah, I felt quite average on this one. I gave it 3 stars. I think this book could have also just been I read it at the wrong time, because it was around the time I started getting very slumpy and I wasn't reading as much. But at the same time, I feel like maybe I'm justified in not liking it, because I also read books like Finlay Donovan around this period and I loved that. So maybe it was the book, I don't know. And yeah, I think the pacing was off, and I found it really anticlimactic as well. It wasn't addictive or a page turner, which I really find to be important in my thrillers and murder mysteries. Let's talk about a book I really enjoyed my experience reading, and that is The Miracles of Namiya General Store, which is by Keigo Higashino. Now, if you were watching my videos last year, you would have seen me go on a bit of a journey with this author. He became one of my favorite new to me authors in 2021. I read all his thriller books last year. So this was my first book of his that is not a thriller murder mystery. This is like a contemporary slice of life story with a touch of a fantastical element to it. And I loved this. I read this I think in February and I gave it 4 stars. The story starts off and we're introduced to these 3 delinquents who we know have just committed a crime. We're not informed of what that crime is, but you know they're on the run. So they are on the run. It's like nighttime and they come across this old abandoned general store which they decide to take shelter in for the night because they're fleeing from the police. They are hiding out in this general store when all of a sudden there is a letter delivered in the mail slot, and they open up the letter. It's from this young girl who is asking for advice and sharing her life problems essentially. They kind of write it off as a joke and they do reply, and then it ends up becoming this whole exchange. The story goes beyond that, but I don't really want to explain too much other than saying that we follow those 3 delinquents and then we do switch POVs. We switch POVs to the girl writing letters. There's other people who write letters. There's a POV where we get of the person who used to own the store, and in the end all the stories are connected, and that was my favorite thing about this book. It was just beautiful. Like, how I would simply put this book is it's very much a slice of life story, focusing on like everyday sort of struggles and choices, but it definitely has a touch of magic, and I just thought it was beautiful. It's a very comforting read, very enchanting. I definitely think some people might find it a little bit boring, but I just was captivated by the story the whole time, and I found it so satisfying to get to the end and know how everything connects. The next 2 books I want to talk about are part of a series. I read Legacy and Unlocked, which are the next 2 books I was up to in the Keeper of the Lost Cities series. So Legacy is book 8. Unlocked is a guide for the most part of the world, and also has a novella in the guide as well. So it's like 8.5. So it's not an official book installment in the series, it's like an addition. I love this series. I have actually a whole vlog which I'm hoping will be out soon. I filmed this vlog basically at the beginning of the year, right when I started to stop making videos, and I've had it like mostly edited since the beginning of the year, so I just need to kind of go back, and I might read like 1 more book for the vlog now and then I'll release the vlog which I feel a little bit silly about doing because I filmed it so many months ago, but it's a vlog I'm really excited about. But anyway, my thoughts as I was reading those books in that vlog. They're comfort reads for me. I have so much investment in these characters as well. This series starts off in book 1 and we're introduced to Sophie. She's only 12 years old, and where I'm at now in the series, she's about 17. So she's a character, you know, you grow up with as you read the series, and I just have so much nostalgia for this story and this world. It isn't a series I read growing up, obviously, but it feels so much like a lot of books I read growing up. Sophie in book 1, she's just a regular 12-year-old girl, she thinks, but she finds out that she's not, that she's actually an elf, and she's taken to this magical world where the elves live, and that's essentially the story. And she has like an amazing group of friends. It has like a lot of found family elements, like she gets adopted, but then she also has like her friendship group that's also like a found family. I have just so much investment in the story for all these characters. I will say that some of these books are way too long. They're like 800 pages. There is definitely a need for an editor to cut down these books. They do not need to be as long as they are. I really enjoyed book 8. It's definitely been one of my favorite books in the series. Some books in the series I haven't liked as much. I think what really made me like this book was we definitely had some interesting developments in the plot and just some interesting reveals that I did not see coming. Some books in this series, it feels like nothing happens and it feels like a filler, but this installment definitely felt like it was moving things forward. That's also the same for the novella. The novella I really enjoyed as well, because in the series we only get Sophie's POV, but we actually get an additional POV in the novella where we're following one of the other characters. I don't really want to say who. Yeah, I'm not going to say who. But that other character is one of my favorite characters, so I was really happy that we also got to see the story through their perspective, and there was also some very interesting developments for them. Next, I want to talk about the love hypothesis, which I did read in a reading vlog, so I have that linked. But I really enjoyed this. We're following Olive, who is a PhD student, and she just gets entangled with a professor called Adam, and they end up fake dating, and that's kind of the story. I really enjoyed this. I just love the characters. I loved their banter. I loved the tension between them. I really loved the facade they kept up with the fake dating. I think when it comes to fake dating, I enjoy it being in like a small setting. So here it's set at a college, or like I would enjoy if it's like at an office. I just think it makes for such a fun scenario, because they've got to like keep pretending in these kind of environments and like make sure no one knows, or like fool everyone like their friends and colleagues or whatever. It's a little messy and it's fun, and I like it that way. I also enjoyed that it had more than just the romance developing. Like it talks about women in STEM, and it also includes a lot about Olive's like research and her passion for her PhD, but also her like financial struggles trying to get through all this. And I just enjoy it. Like I enjoyed like romance where like the romance is good and the romance is happening, but then there's also extra things happening outside the romance that really gives the story to build the character a little bit more instead of just like building the romance. I think it's also important to build those characters individually. And it had the grumpy sunshine trope, which it's always a lot of fun to read about. For how much I enjoyed the story, I feel like I would have a lot more to say right now, but I don't. Other than I really agree with everyone who have hyped this up. I think it's a really solid romance, and I haven't picked up any more Elle Hazelwood. When I first finished this book, I was really wanting to, but I've heard that all those stories are kind of similar, so I definitely think I will give her latest release, which I want to say is called Love on the Brain, but that doesn't sound right. I don't know, it's got a pink cover, I can't remember the title of it, but I definitely want to give that one a go. And I'm not sure about her other books. I know she has a whole bunch of like short stories, but I don't know if I will read them. In that same reading vlog where I read The Love Hypothesis, I also read All Roads Lead Here by Marina Zapata. This was my first book by Marina Zapata, and to be honest, it might be my last. I wasn't the greatest fan of this. I was really excited because a lot of people said that this was the best slow burn, and I really love slow burn, but I think the issue is when I've read slow burn, most of the time it's been a fantasy book with a romance that has a slow burn romance. And because of fantasy, there's like so much going on, so much more that I'm interested in going on, that it feels more satisfying when the romance happens. Whereas here it was just like, I was bored by the time we got to the romance. The setup of this book is we are following our main character, Aurora, I think her name was. She has just ended a very long-term relationship with a boyfriend she's been with for about a decade or so, and she is on a journey of sorts to re-find herself, I guess, because so much of her identity for so long has been Aurora in this relationship, and now she's like Aurora single. So she rents out it's like a garage or like a condo at the back of a house, and she goes there. It turns out that the person who rented out the condo was a teenage boy, and he did this without permission of his father. So she is like staying in this condo, and all of a sudden this like man is like, what the hell are you doing in this condo? And she's like, I rented it, I paid for it. Teenage boy gets caught out. She doesn't leave because she's paid for it, so she ends up staying, and then the romance ends up being between her and the dad. So it's like a DILF romance essentially. The thing is, right, I liked the idea behind this. I liked the idea of this girl trying to like reclaim herself, like reclaim her identity after being, you know, giving so much of herself away to this relationship she had in the past. I really enjoyed that, but the actual romance I did not care about. I did not think these characters had like chemistry. I didn't feel it. I didn't care for their banter. I didn't like the dialogue as well, so I think that would have impacted how I felt about these characters' interactions. I thought there were so many scenes that felt like they were repeated. Like there were these scenes where the main character would have this encounter in her little condo with some sort of animal. Like there was this like whole bat scenario, and then there was like a mouse scenario, and then the love interest would have to jump in to save her, and I just didn't care. I just did not care. There was just way too much filler content in the story that didn't add any substance to the book overall. I think it was probably a mistake on my part to have read this right after reading The Love Hypothesis, which I loved, and like this I just did not love. I'll leave it there because those two books are in the same vlog. I also read the first two books in the Elder Scrolls Curses series. The series name is blanking me, but book 1 is The Red Scrolls of Magic, and book 2 is The Lost Book of White. This is part of Cassandra Clare's Shadowhunter Chronicles series. Essentially, book 1 is set in between City of Glass and City of Fallen Angels, and then book 2, Lost Book of White, is set in between City of Heavenly Fire and Lady Midnight. I just think these did not need to be made. I love Alec and Magnus. That's who we follow. They're two beloved characters of the original series, and this is supposed to be their adult series where we follow them. I just think there are too many plot holes. I can't forgive it. I can't forgive decisions that were made here. I think that also Cassandra Clare is just kind of repeating the way she tells stories. She has a formula that's like copied and paste here. I can kind of forgive that to some extent because I'm choosing to read these books. I have a lot of nostalgia for her original series. I think for someone who's written so many books, I don't think her writing has developed that much. Is that a really mean thing to say? Should I take that back? No, I'm not going to take that back. It was cool to see more of Magnus and Alec together. It was cool to get more of Magnus's like backstory and such, but they are not necessary. And I think the way she created all these plot holes, like there are characters in here that have died in the original series that come back, and she gives the laziest explanation as to why these characters are now alive in this sequel series. It doesn't make any sense, and to be honest, I think what really bothered me is it changed how I feel about the original series. Like now nothing that happens in the original series really matters because she can just like bring characters back to life whenever she wants, or she can just change the story, and like it doesn't matter. It just really irked me. I don't think it's necessary. At the end of the day, that's what I think. My other complaint actually is this is supposed to be an adult series, but it felt no different to how her YA books are written and told. No difference in really content either. Let's change the tune a little bit and talk about a book that I have a lot of positive things to say. This is one of my only 5-star reads of the year, and that is The Daughter of the Moon Goddess. I adored this. It's based on the Mid-Autumn Legend, and the Mid-Autumn Legend, from what I know, follows Nghi, who is someone in prison on the moon, essentially. She is the moon goddess and she has like a human lover, and we follow the daughter of these two. And our protagonist, the daughter, she's grown up on the moon. She's never known any other sort of life. She only knows her mother and the moon, and that's kind of it. She one day is almost discovered by the people who had imprisoned her mother because she has magical abilities that she's not really familiar with. And she sort of uses them, and she's not supposed to because it can tell others who shouldn't know that she's there and that she's hiding that she is there. So she has to flee for her life. So she has to leave her mother on the moon, and she escapes to the celestial kingdom. There she decides and becomes very determined to find out a way to free her mother from her imprisonment. So that is kind of where our journey begins, and she finds herself at court with the emperor's son, the prince, and there she learns alongside the prince. Like, she learns skills such as archery, and then like lessons in military and all sorts of things, and they're kind of raised together in a sense, and she is trying to gain all these skills to hopefully eventually one day free her mother. I think what stood out to me the most was the characters. I had so much investment in them. I think also the dynamics between them were amazing. Like, there's a love triangle in here. This made me feel things. Like, thinking back to it now, I've read this like all the way back in February, so my memory's like a little bit vague on some things, but so much happened in the story. Like, it just kept going and going and going, and I loved it. I just thought it was such a page turner. It was so addictive. I was so invested and rooted in the story, and I cannot wait for the sequel to come out because it actually comes out really quite soon. Like, when do we get a duology where book 1 and book 2 is released in the same year? Never, right? Like, this is the first, right? So I think I may reread this, maybe. I feel like I should because my memory is kind of vague. There's a twist at the end, and the last, I want to say 20 to 30% of this book is absolutely wild. Like, things are just happening. I think what this book also did really great was there was political intrigue from the beginning, and I love political intrigue. Like, I think it's a must in my fantasies. It creates so much tension. It's so terrifying because you don't know who's going to betray you. You got to be clever, you got to have your wits about you and play the game. I think it's great. I just think this also just did it really well, and I really enjoyed the magic as well. I think from what I remember, it was quite vague, but you kind of understood it as it went. Just a very enchanting story, honestly. I just loved it. I think the last thing I'll say about it is it's a very accessible read. It's got so much going for it. Like, it has like really fascinating characters, it has really interesting magic and court politics, but it's very accessible. Read this if you haven't. I highly recommend. I also completed the short story collection for the Girl and Fire and Thorns trilogy. This is the first book in this trilogy, which I thought I would just hold up so you can see what book series I'm talking about. The short story collection are 3 short novellas that take place before the beginning of this book. So it is a set of prequel novellas, and I quite enjoyed them. I love this trilogy, The Girl with Fire and Thorns. I haven't spoken about it for quite some time, but it's definitely one of my favorite YA fantasy series, and I've read it a couple of times. We follow Alyssa, who is a young princess who was born with this like godstone in her belly button. Each generation, only one person is born with this godstone, and all that is known is that person is destined for greatness. Like, they're destined to do something that will like change the world, essentially. Like, it's very huge, but no one really knows what they're destined for. So this prequel novellas, we follow Alyssa's older sister, which I quite enjoyed because the sisters don't really get along much. so we get to understand more of her sister's perspective and why their relationship isn't great. And then in the second novella we follow her good friend, and in the final novella we follow her love interest. I think what I liked most about these novellas is because in the original trilogy we only follow Alyssa's perspective, so it was nice to get to know these other characters seen through their own eyes, not Alyssa's eyes, but also get their backstory. I really enjoyed the second novella the most, I think, which was her friend Mara's story. I think that was the most that happened in Mara's story, but also it was also the most reminiscent of the original trilogy. There's like a little bit of traveling that goes on, and there's more stuff happening, and I just really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed getting to know like Mara from her past. I wouldn't recommend reading it as a starter to get into this series because I don't think you would care for the novellas or the characters in the novellas without having read the original trilogy. And I didn't give it a rating, I just kind of read it for curiosity and enjoyment, to try and, you know, get some extra content out of a series I really enjoy. I also read Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. This was my first Riley Sager and I wasn't super impressed. So we have our main character whose dad's died, and she gets the will and she finds out that her dad has left her this house that her family owned when she was a child. She had assumed that her parents sold this house off long ago because living there and the events that happened while they were living there ended their family. It's very unclear to her what exactly went down while they're living there because it's something that her parents have also refused to ever discuss with her. So she decides to go back to this house that she's inherited and to fix it up. At the same time, she wants to also figure out what the hell happened when she was living there as a kid. Then the other narrative that or POV that we're following in this story is her father was an author and he wrote a ghost story about this house, like it was a haunted house. And our main character's always been unsure whether the events that her father wrote about are true or not. So we're also getting this story of our main character, present day, going back to this house, and then this ghost story that her father wrote. And that's kind of how the story plays out. I wanted to get scared from this. I wanted to be thrilled, but it never happened. I don't know if like horror books are for me because I just don't think I get scared from them. This book was just so meh to me. Like that's the only thing that's coming back to me thinking on it now. Like there was nothing really stand out. Even when the reveal all happened, I didn't guess it, but I just didn't care when it happened. I also listened to the audiobook of The Stand-In, which is an audiobook you can get for free if you're a member of Audible. I'm not sponsored or anything, but I just thought I would mention it. I really quite enjoyed this. It is a romance, but it's like very light on the romance. It's more like a contemporary story with a romance. We follow a girl who at the beginning of the story is in a bit of a rough patch. Like she's just been fired from her job. She needs to figure out a way to financially support herself, as well as her mother who has Alzheimer's and is living in a nursing home. She basically like encounters this celebrity, this Chinese actress who she looks alike. It ends up being a story where they switch places, hence the name The Stand-In. I really enjoyed the story. Like it just has that fun trope of these two characters, one rich, one poor, swapping spots. But I enjoyed their friendship development throughout the story, and there's a romance on the side. I enjoyed like the conversation in here about like mental health and such. It was just a really delightful read, and I just had a very fun reading experience. It's definitely a simple story, and I think if you're going in with the expectation that there's going to be like an amazing romance in this, it's not that. Like it's definitely more contemporary. I also read volume 1 of Yona of the Dawn. I enjoyed this first installment and I still haven't continued. I don't know why, but I need to continue with the series. We essentially follow Yona, who is this very sheltered, spoiled princess. She ends up having to flee from her kingdom, her life, because someone that was very close to her kills her father and takes claim of the kingdom. and takes rulership. So she's in danger and has to flee with her bodyguard. I wanted to read this because I knew it has the princess and the bodyguard trope. I really enjoyed the initial setup. I'm excited to see where it goes. One of my favorite story tropes is when we have someone like Yona, who is like a sheltered princess who has to be a bit of a fish out of water and has to learn how to survive and toughen up, I guess. Like, I really enjoy seeing characters who have a lot of privilege and who've lived a very like easy life be thrown into the deep end and struggle, and I think that's why I really quite enjoyed this, and I'm excited to see where the story goes. I also reread Every Heart a Doorway. I actually was gonna do a 24-hour readathon vlog where I read all the books in this series, and I read this book, I started the vlog, I didn't go beyond that, so yeah, so I just read this first book and I liked it, but I actually didn't like it as much as the first time I read it. The first time I read this book, I did give it 4 stars, and the second time I gave it 3 stars. Brief synopsis, because I feel like you probably heard of this book, but we follow a girl who I want to say her name is Nancy. I think it's Nancy. She has just returned from this portal world and she is now being moved to live into Eleanor West's Home for Wayward Children, which is a home basically for all these children who have returned from portal worlds and are struggling to adjust back to the human world. I love hearing about all the different portal worlds and these characters struggling to like readjust back into society. I think that whole like idea and premise was so fascinating, and there was so many different directions and conversations to be had and like ways they could go. But this is like random murder that happens in this book, and that's like the main plot, and I'm like, why do we just insert this like random murder? It just felt a little bit out of place. Like, I understand the choice and I see where it's like going, but I didn't love that part. Let me know if you've read more of the newer books in this series, because I wanted to read the newer books. That's why I reread this first one, but I obviously just never continued on with my reread, and now I'm questioning if I should read up to the new ones. I want to quickly talk about a book I really enjoyed, and that is The Wolf of Oren-Yaro. This is book 1 in the Bitch Queen series. I think this is one of those books I actually enjoyed more when I finished it than when I was actually reading it. I wasn't quite sure how I was feeling about this book during the reading process. But we essentially follow Queen Talion, who she has quite a complicated life. She had this marriage with this basically a prince from a rival clan, and they have this son together, and they were supposed to have this joint coronation to join their clans, but the night before their coronation the husband runs away. We are now like 5 years into the future at the start of this book. Things have always been on edge ever since he ran away, because there's a potential war that could happen between these two peoples. She gets a letter from her husband asking for her to meet him, and they can have a meeting to sort of try and resolve the situation. So she has to go to this meeting with her entourage of people to go see this husband who abandoned her. On their way to this meeting, there's an assassination attempt, which ends up resulting in Queen Talion being separated from her people that she attended the meeting with, and then she's on her own on the run, kind of like Yona of the Dawn, sort of like on her run, fleeing for her life, and then she has to try and find her way back to her people. It's a really interesting narration. It was quite unclear at first, like what was going on. Like, I felt like I didn't know where the story was going, but it does make sense in the end. And I think what I loved about this book the most was it is quite a slow burn. Like, I feel like it took a little bit of time for the characters to grow on me, but once I warmed up to them, like particularly Queen Talion, I really enjoyed her. Like I said before about Yona of the Dawn, I love that like fish out of water sort of trope, and that's what we had here. She definitely has her privileges and she finds herself like on her own on the streets, having to sort of survive. I love the political intrigue I did not know who to trust a lot of the time. I thought the development of it all was very interesting and fascinating and like very well done. Well done in the sense that I don't really realize what was building up. Talking about this book now, I'm thinking about it more fondly than I thought about it while reading it, and I definitely need to continue. I'm very intrigued. Like, I really hope the stakes are gonna keep going higher. Like, that's kind of the sense I got. And I believe it was originally a self-published book, so that's incredible that it got picked up, and I'm so glad it did because it really deserves it. I gave it 3.75 stars though. It's not like the highest rating, like it's a good rating from me, but I wonder if I were to reread it, I may rate it higher, perhaps. Get ready for another rant because I want to talk about the most disappointing book I read this year, and that was A Winter's Promise. I was not a fan of this. I did not like this at all. I was so excited about this book. The way I'd seen people talk about it for a long time reminded me of a lot of books that I read growing up. It follows Ophelia, who is this girl with a very large family, and she is a museum curator. She has a couple magical abilities. One where she can travel through mirrors, and the other where she can touch objects and she knows the entire history of the objects. So she can read objects to a certain degree. At the beginning of the story, she has an arranged marriage, and the person she's engaged to, he lives on like the other side of the world. So she has to travel with her godmother and him and go live at his place. What frustrated me about this book was there was so much initial fascinating setup. Like her magic, Ophelia's magic, was so interesting. The world was so interestingly set up as well because it's like these floating islands. The interesting parts of the story were only ever mentioned, and there was never any exploring or even like her magic really playing a part of the story. It never went beyond that, and it really disappointed me in that sense. I felt like a whole lot of nothing happened in this book. Essentially, when she's at her fiance's home, there's like a lot of supposed like court politics going on because a lot of his family don't like him, and there's a lot of grudges, and they're all very dangerous, and she has to like basically make sure not to step on anyone's toes. I actually never felt intrigued. Like, I never cared about this political intrigue that was happening. I didn't find it fascinating. It just was so lackluster and disappointing to me. Even the fiance, he was like so absent from the story for such a large part of it. And I think one of the issues with what this book was trying to do was it was trying to be very mysterious, but so mysterious that it just kept you too far back. Like, you gotta show a little bit when there's mystery, you know? You gotta make people intrigued. You want to make them curious, but it just kept you way far, too far, way far, too far in the dark. I didn't care because I couldn't see anything. I think I also just feel quite sour about this book because I had really high hopes. I was disappointed. I was waiting for things to happen. Nothing ever really happened. I may give the sequel a go. Like, please convince me if you've read the rest of the books in the series. Like, I would really like to be convinced. Because like I said, there were interesting elements. I just wanted more than just interesting elements. I wanted them to go somewhere. I wanted things to be explored and fleshed out, and they were not. So I gave it 2 stars. The only Robin Hood book I've read this year is The Willful Princess and The Piebald Bard. I liked this. I think it has Robin Hood's beautiful writing and storytelling. It can be quite emotional at times as well, this story. It's essentially 2 parts, this story. So in part 1 we're following the princess, and in part 2 we're following the prince character, and I much preferred part 1 over part 2. In part 1 we follow the perspective of this daughter of a wet nurse, and this wet nurse is also the wet nurse for the queen, so she's the wet nurse for the princess. This daughter grows up alongside the princess, and they're very, very close. We do hear quite briefly about this story in the original series. I want to say it's in one of the Farseer books that we hear about this. This story like gives you an understanding of why people in this world who have the wit magic, which is a magic that connects people to animals, why they are so outcasted and treated the way they are in the world that we know from Assassin's Apprentice that we're introduced to in that series. Here at the beginning, people with the wit are not treated like outcasted. They're people who actually work with animals in the stables or as vets or like sheep herders, and they're respected. So it was very interesting to see how like society had changed and treated, and the events surrounding that change. Like that's what this book is about. But I think where this book, I guess, sort of lost me was I really liked the characters in Robin Hobb's other books. Like I really liked them, whereas in here I didn't really like them that much. I didn't really care for them as much. So even though there were times I was like kind of emotional, I just didn't care for it as much because I didn't care for them as much. I did like this because like Fitz having the wit is such a huge part of his character, and him hiding it is such a huge part of his story. So it was good to have more context of that and like history of the world. I will say though, part 1 of this story gave the strongest sapphic vibes, and I was so disappointed because it wasn't sapphic, but it should have been. It should have been. Like the way Robin Hobb writes sometimes, she makes me question things. I don't know. I also want to talk about a manga series I've been obsessed with, and that is Spy Family. This is volume 7, which I haven't read yet, but I read volumes 1 to 6 in July or August, somewhere around there, and I really enjoyed this series. We follow essentially this found family. We have a spy who's the father, we have an assassin who's the mum. They don't know of each other's occupations, and we also have the adopted daughter who is a telepath. The spy's mission is he has to try and infiltrate this private school to get close to this important like political figure who's a parent of some of the kids that go to the school. That's the story. Like it's so like chaotic. It's got the found family trope, which I love, which I always talk about loving. It's so cute. Like Anya is one of the cutest characters ever. I really enjoy also just how funny this is. Like it's quite funny. I take so much joy from this series, and yeah, I really recommend it. I read this in my first vlog back, I believe, like from my break, so I will leave the link to the video and you can see what I thought of the first 7 volumes in that vlog, because I definitely had a lot to say about them as I was reading them. The other book I also read in my return to YouTube vlog was Eva Evergreen. It's Ava Evergreen. I always say Eva. It's Ava. We follow this young witch who is a novice witch, and the first stage of the witching journey essentially is that she has to help this town. So she goes to this small town to help all the people out, but she's not very good at magic. They describe it in the book that she only has a pinch of magic, so she can only use so much magic before passing out. It's just so cute, so wholesome. I really love the small town setting. The journey the protagonist goes on is really lovely as well, because she's someone who's constantly told that she's not good. She's not a good witch, so she does lack self-confidence, and her journey to like gain confidence was really lovely to follow. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, recommend if you want a cute comfort read that's reminiscent of Studio Ghibli, particularly Kiki's Delivery Service. Read this. We're finally on the last book. I feel like I've run a marathon. The last book we're going to talk about is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jim McCurdy, which I'm not the only person who've read this recently. I feel like everyone on the internet has. I did watch iCarly growing up. I don't think I was ever like super obsessed. Like I was more a Disney girl. Like I was more a Hannah Montana girl than I was an iCarly girl, but I definitely did watch it, so I was very intrigued. I'd listened to the audiobook because Jeanette does narrate it herself, and I thought she did a really great job. It essentially follows her from when she's very young to about, I think it's like I want to say 24 years old, around there. So we see her like starting out with her acting journey, like how she started with like the pressure of her mum, like her first few jobs, and then her actually getting into iCarly, what that was like. She was so honest, and I could never be this honest to the world, but she was very honest about things that she went through, things she did as well. I also really loved the narration of this, particularly when she was sharing her experiences as a child. I thought was so well done, because you had that child's voice telling you the story, but then you also had this like perspective from her adult self popping in, sort of explaining and like clarifying in a way that didn't disrupt the story. Like, her child self didn't understand the context of things, or sort of how messed up some of the situations she was in because of her mother were, but her adult self would sort of jump in and give more perspective on it and explain it. It was done so well. It reminded me a lot of The Glass Castle, which is another non-fiction book about a girl who was raised in a very dysfunctional family and like grows up and finds success. It really reminded me of that. So I recommend, if you really like Jeanette's book, to read The Glass Castle, and then if you really like The Glass Castle, to maybe read Jeanette's book. I really like this. Did not give it a rating because it's a non-fiction and I just feel weird about rating non-fiction. I think I'm gonna end the video there because like this has been going on for like 2 hours. And I'm tired now from all this filming. I haven't sat down to film a wrap up in a long time, so maybe I bit up a little bit more than I could chew with doing such a big one. Maybe I should have broken up these books a little bit more, but we're done now. Let me know if you have any more thoughts on any of these books I discussed. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you're enjoying whatever you're currently reading, and hopefully I will see you next time.